Good evening and welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual Author Talk series. My name is Sheffield Hale, President and CEO, and I'm thrilled to be welcoming you to this event with author David O. Stewart for his book, George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father. He'll be in conversation with Kevin Butterfield, the Executive Director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington, also known as the Washington Library at Mount Vernon. During David and Kevin's conversation, please use the Q&A to submit your questions. They will get to as many as possible in the time we have. We encourage you to purchase a copy of the book from tonight's official bookseller, local independent bookstore, Acapella Books. You will find a link to do so in the chat. Now I'd like to briefly introduce tonight's guests. Like me, David O. Stewart is a lawyer without portfolio. He's retired and writing books. He spent a career in Washington, D.C. defending accused criminals and challenging government actions as unconstitutional, and is the author of 4 books on American history, including national bestsellers and award winners. David was formerly the president of the Washington Independent Review of Books. The Wall Street Journal recently called George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father, quote, an outstanding biography with writing that is clear, often superlative, providing a narrative drive such a life deserves. Kevin's work at the library, which serves as the Presidential Library for George Washington, includes fostering new scholarly research about George Washington and the founding era, overseeing a variety of research, leadership and education fellowships, hosting numerous scholarly programs and author lectures, and of course, collecting, archiving, and digitizing Washington's books and manuscripts, and relevant 18th century books, maps, and documents. Kevin is the author of The Making of de Tocqueville's America, Law and Association in the Early United States. David and Kevin, thank you for both being here this evening, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Sheffield. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be here speaking with you, David. I want to dive right into the middle of your book, and I mean that literally. The middle of your book, or thereabouts, takes us to 1774. The First Continental Congress is convening at a time of crisis and uncertainty. And George Washington arrives. Could you tell us a little bit about who that man is in 1774 and what the people made of him?
For that First Continental Congress, he is a leader from Virginia. Virginia is the biggest colony, and the most significant one. And he has risen really just in the previous 5 to 7 years or so to a position of real prominence within the House of Burgesses and in Virginia politics. You know, he started as a military man, and then he went off and mostly worked as a farmer and land speculator. He always kept his hand in political matters, but as the conflict with Britain had escalated, he really dove into that, and he had a very strong, determined opposition to the British policies that were roiling the colonies. And partly because of who he had become, he really rose to the top in Virginia. And he's an interesting political figure because he didn't have some of the qualities you expect. He was not a particularly good orator. He avoided that by and large. His voice wasn't too good. He was embarrassed about his modest education, and he was not as forceful as you would expect a leader to be. He was very consultative and had learned the ropes in the House of Burgesses, the legislature in colonial Virginia, and had been there 16 years, figuring it out very slowly, and had proved adept by the time you get to 1774. At that point, he's George Washington. He's had some natural advantages that he always had. He was usually the biggest man in the room. He always looked good. He made sure his clothes were good. And he had presence. There's just no doubt about it. When he walked into a room, people looked at him and he commanded the room. So that's not a bad place to start if you want to be a political figure.
It's one thing to impress a room of nobodies. The First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress is certainly not that. What did his fellow members of Congress make of him? What did they write down about him? What did they say about him when they first encountered or after they got to know George
The
Washington?
first Congress is interesting because there are two main committees that do most of the work, and he's not on either of them. And you sort of think, well, maybe he's not very important, but he spent his time socializing and building and networking, we would call it today, and connecting with all the people in the Congress, as well as the important people in Philadelphia, and made a great impression. He did have a carryover military reputation, which his bearing confirmed. And then it's really in the Second Continental Congress, which he shows up in his uniform, his old militia uniform. And, the country is careening towards war. So there's nothing subtle about it. And he really makes a huge impression on the people then. Americans did not have many experienced military people. Washington's military career had been checkered, but he had one, which, was more than most could say. And he made a huge impression by his sort of deliberate style, his thoughtfulness, his willingness to hear people out. And he did have expertise about military matters. How do you get fighting men together? How do you provision them? How do you organize the idea of an army? And that Second Continental Congress, which begins in spring of 1775, the delegates write home and they're just blown away by him. They're just so impressed with him. And it's rather like his House of Burgesses career. He starts quietly and he makes his impression slowly, but by the Second Continental Congress, he is a leadership figure and the odds-on favorite to be commander-in-chief of the army.
Over the course of the next little while, I want to take us back in time and try to get your take on how he becomes that over the course of the 1750s and 60s. But there's a question coming in, and I want to encourage everyone to submit questions. Michelle asks, because she teaches your book, Summer of 1787, to students quite a bit, she says.
Bless you, Michelle.
And she asks, how long does it take you to research a book like this, either the summer book or the new book on Washington? How do you decide on your topics?
You have to pick a topic that you're willing to work on for a number of years. So that's the principal criteria. And you also need to find one that you think other people will be interested in, and including publishers. The time it takes varies. And, summer 1787, I was dealing with 4 months of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. And that didn't take that long. It was 4 months and the sources were limited. It was a while ago, so actually the internet and digital resources weren't quite as good. For this book, George Washington, it took a while. He had a big life. I had to cover a lot of it, and did. I skipped some of the war period, thinking it wasn't as important for my thesis about his political talents. But it did take, the whole project took 5 years. So, and the first book only took 2. So and I was still practicing law a bit then. So, Washington, it was a big life he had. We've got, I don't know, 80 volumes of his papers have been published.
Thereabouts.
And, I looked at every one. I won't say I read every one word for word, but I looked at them all. You got to look at a lot of other stuff too. So it took a while.
Well, let's go back in time, back into the 1750s. You may have things that you want to say about how the boyhood Washington shaped where we are, but I'll take us to the 1750s and you can fill in where you'd like. There's a war. It's not the Revolutionary War that we'll also talk about tonight, but the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. Washington finds himself not just involved, but there at the outset, which is an astonishing historical phenomenon. But I wonder if you could say a little word about Washington the warrior. And then I want to ask you about Washington and his political maneuverings this time, because I think they're two very different stories. But tell us a little bit about Washington the soldier.
As a soldier from the very beginning, he's this big athletic guy who's got great presence and has a sense of himself and has one of the things that is great for a military leader in those eras. In that era, he seemed at least to be not to be afraid or be able to command his fear. And he was in some terrible situations as a young soldier, and again, actually, during the Revolutionary War. And there's no suggestion that he ever flinched, and he was ever anything except composed. There's one time in the Revolutionary War where it seems he just got so angry with his own troops that he kind of lost it. But mostly in the presence of the enemy, he had great courage. The issue in his early years in the French and Indian War, and it is sort of remarkable that he pretty much started it with his first skirmish, he is impetuous and he does not consult with others the way he would as a more mature military officer and then as a politician. And I think in retrospect, he had troubles in this period. It was 4 years when he was commanding Virginia troops. And he had just terrible lack of success. There's no other way to put it. Some of it was just the white Virginian soldiers were terrible in the forest, and the Indians they were fighting against were brilliant forest fighters. Some of it was kind of mutton-headed British officers, and he was very impatient with them, which is not a smart thing to do when you're a subordinate. And he managed to alienate most of them. He was at the Braddock debacle, the Battle of the Monongahela in 1755, and that is sort of where the myth begins of sort of the courageous Washington who can never be hurt, because it's a terrible debacle. They lose, I think they have a 2/3 casualty rate. It's like the worst that the British armed forces had to that time. And Washington is the biggest man on the field. He is on a horse, and the enemy is all around them in the woods, and he's rushing back and forth with orders from General Braddock to the different units that are performing so badly. And he never gets a scratch. And it's a miracle. Bullets go through his coat. They shoot a couple of horses out from under him. And that is the beginning of the myth. And it is a reminder to all of us that luck is really an important part of success.
Right. Well, one of the things too that you've already hinted at is his alienation of people he's reporting to, including governors and royal officials. It seems to me that he loses the ability to sort of control his own temper sometimes with the people with whom he should least risk losing it. Some of the letters come out as downright angry. I think he even quits a time or two. Tell us a little bit about the sort of political missteps of Washington during this time.
I think he resigned 7 times at 6 months. At one point, one of his older brothers writes him and says, if you really go through with this resignation, you will never live it down. This is the worst thing you could do. He does have a temper, and he has a temper his whole life. And as president, there's one cabinet meeting where he sort of loses it, and the cabinet members who were there were dazzled to just that he could carry on. And it's hard to be angry that long, but he was capable of it. And as a younger man, a lot of us when we're younger aren't so good at controlling ourselves. And what was surprising to me was so many of his writings, as you suggest, were caustic and disrespectful. The colonial governor had a fellow named Dinwiddie had actually advanced Washington, and Washington had Dinwiddie to thank for his position and his career to that point. And Washington just could not write a civil letter to him at a certain point. And it was dumb. He alienated the guy completely. He also did it with his, the commander of the final advance against the Indians that he was part of, General Forbes, and he jumped the chain of command, which in military terms, it's a little like shooting at the king. It better work, and it didn't work, and the general didn't admire it. And Washington resigns from the Virginia military at the end of 1758, and basically, he's fouled the nest. He's not going to have a military career, it certainly seems.
That's right about the time, and in fact, it's right exactly the time that he joined the House of Burgesses. Tell us a little bit about this body, for anyone who's unsure about the Virginia Colonial Assembly, but also tell us a little bit about George Washington's entry into it.
Well, he was always interested in politics. Both of his older brothers served in the House of Burgesses, and his grandfather as had his great-grandfather. Now, none of them had been very significant, but they had served, so it was part of a tradition. And he did engage very much with the Fairfax family. This was a key family. They owned most of Northern Virginia. They were next door to him at Mount Vernon, at Fort Belvoir, well, what is now Fort Belvoir. It was then just Belvoir. And they help him, and he coordinates with them. He's very careful never to run against the Fairfax. The House of Burgesses is essentially the lower house of the legislature. They have two representatives from each county, and a few other strays show up. And they do get to vote on budgets and things like that. It's not super powerful, but it does play a significant political role. And all of the important people in the colony serve in the House of Burgesses or on the governor's executive council. The Fairfaxes tend to be on the governor's executive council, but Washington was in the House, and he starts out as what we would call maybe a backbencher. He's not significant, and he really works his way up, again, slowly and steadily.
One of the other changes in his life right around this time that I think you do some great work with in the book is his marriage, and his the different perspective that he has once he becomes the head of household, and Martha, the role that she plays in his life. Tell us a little bit about George and Martha Washington. There's actually a moment too where you describe better than anything I've read thus far why Martha Washington would have trusted this man. In fact, I think you put it very nicely. Why she would, because she has two young children. She needs to find someone reliable, and she sees in him reliability. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast because he's just finished a military career by being somewhat tempestuous and volatile. But in personal relations, he had an emotional accessibility and an ability to connect with people that was a great advantage his whole life. And it clearly worked with Martha very well. It's a puzzling thing because they destroyed each other's correspondence, and they were very discreet about their relationship. So we don't know too much. What we do know is in sort of 2 weekends in the month of March, he visits her and woos her and wins her. And she accepts his proposal of marriage. She is a widow. She has been married to an extraordinarily rich man and has 2 children by him. They're about the same age, George and Martha, and they're physical opposites. George is tall and lean, and apparently he's got biggest hands anybody's ever seen. And she is under 5 foot, round. and by all accounts, quite charming. That I put stock in Abigail Adams as a truth teller in this era, who was not easy to buffalo, and she just thought the world of Martha and thought she was a fine person. But we don't know a great deal about their relationship together. Being head of a family, having these stepchildren, which, they sort of frustrate him because they're Martha's children, they're not his, and he has to control himself. And give her control of the children, which he does. There's a wonderful line. Somebody says that he decided he would rather have spoiled children in the house than a discontented spouse. It's all part of the maturing process that he goes through. And I think it was very salutary for him. And he was ready for a different stage in his life. He'd been on the frontier in pretty miserable conditions for 4 years. And I'm sure family life felt good.
We don't have to go into exactly how and when George takes full possession of Mount Vernon, but they are living in Mount Vernon at this point. They're beginning their married life there. And George Washington in the 1760s is, I think, often a neglected subject of study. I mean, there's nothing about George Washington that's entirely neglected by historians, but quite neglected. And Mount Vernon centers prominently and farming, as does, of course, the political career that I think you chart beautifully in this book. So tell us a little bit about the 1760s and where you see George Washington's evolution through that stretch.
Well, it's interesting at a personal level. He tries desperately to become a tobacco planter, which is what prestigious Virginians did, and it didn't work because the soil at Mount Vernon was not appropriate, and maybe he was no good at it. We don't really know. But he then switched his focus to grains, raising wheat and corn, and that was successful. And he turns Mount Vernon around after running it into debt. And there's a period I think of as maybe his happiest time, in the sort of mid to late 1760s, when he's kind of the squire and he's riding to the hounds a lot, more than you think. And he's very engaged with farming and agriculture. He cares a lot about it. He's very diligent. One quality of Washington, which it's important to remember just when you're trying to understand his success, is he worked harder than anybody he knew. He got up early, maybe 4:30, 5, and he worked until breakfast. And then he went out and was all over the farms and working there. And then he came back, had dinner in the middle of the afternoon, and then he worked some more. There's an anecdote I don't entirely trust, when some subordinate officer said to him during the war, "We're also impressed with how much you get done in the course of a day." And Washington said, "Well, I get up 2 hours before you do." He was very diligent always. If he wanted to get something done, he was the guy who would do it. And the thing you see in his farm management that I found really interesting was how disciplined he was. He was always running experiments to see, he would have 10 ways to fertilize a plant and see which way was most effective. He was trying to figure out, did whale oil candles burn faster than tallow candles? So he ran an experiment on that. He very devoted to what we would call the scientific method, to figure out the best, most efficient way to do things. It was a characteristic of his whole life.
Well, I've just taken a look at the clock, David, and I realize this is my fault, not yours. It's 7:25, and we haven't even come back to the Revolutionary War quite yet. So I want to keep moving forward in time. And of course, the 1760s is marked by one particular moment of colonial resistance, the Stamp Act. George is fairly silent at that time, but he's aware of it. But by the later 1760s and into the early 1770s, how would you describe George Washington's attitude towards British imperial government and his growing prominence in the what I guess you could call colonial resistance?
Well, he's quite adamant, and there's nothing measured at all about his response to the British. He's outraged. He thinks they're trampling his liberties and the liberties of Americans, and he thinks we must resist. He grows weary of all the petitions they write to the king, and basically says, "I'm fed up with petitions." And so you would see him as perhaps one wing of the political community then, and that combined with his military background, I think, vaults him. And he knew what he thought on this issue, and he was a military guy, and that elevates him. He has been gaining responsibility within the legislature. He's been taking on financial issues, which he never started with, and he's clearly impressed a lot of people. But this last sort of 6 years before the revolution breaks out, you can see him. They have a way of counting votes where whoever gets the most votes for a situation is listed. You're listed in the order in which you got the votes, and he starts out not very high, and he ends up, I think the last vote, he's number 2. So it is an impressive achievement, frankly, for a guy who didn't make great speeches and was not really a hail fellow well-met political type.
We're coming back into the period where we began, the First and Second Continental Congresses. Keith asked a question that I'll pose to you about Washington's military experience. Who of the others there in the Continental Congresses or other prominent Revolutionary period leaders had military experience? Were there others that rivaled Washington's military experience, and who were they?
It's a great question, and his winning of the commander-in-chief position is largely because the talent pool was so shallow. The contenders against him were a couple of the leading ones were really 2 former British Army officers who'd fought with the British in the French and Indian War in America, Horatio Gates and Charles Lee. Gates had the ability not to impress, and he was sort of not a dynamic personality, not an impressive person. And Lee had the ability to impress in a way that you would never forget him, but you would not want to trust him. He was incredibly smart, incredibly well educated. He spoke a fistful of languages, but he was irretrievably strange. He was terribly skinny. He was funny looking. He traveled with a pack of dogs wherever he went. And he was just not the fellow you might want him as an advisor, but you probably wouldn't want him in charge. When this question comes up on commander-in-chief, the head of the troops that had the militias that have gathered in Boston, is a fellow named Ward, who has some experience from the French and Indian War, but it's really garrison duty. So Washington is, you've got these 2 British guys who have moved to America, but, they're not native born. They're not really from Virginia. He's a Virginian. Being from Virginia was a good thing. And he's got this aura, this, just who he was. And he does have military experiences, patchy as it was. Patchy is not the right word, up and down as it was.
As you mentioned early on, you don't write about the entirety of the war. It's something that you focus on an episode or 2, and one of the episodes that you focus on is of course the famous period around Valley Forge. Why did you choose this period, and what do you pull out of this episode in Washington's life that you found useful for understanding the political development of the man?
Well, I thought this was a time when his political skills really were essential. And, throughout the war, his political skills are essential because he's got to deal with Congress. He's got to deal with governors. He's got to deal with state legislatures and local officials. I mean, I would guess that at least half of most days he is not doing military stuff. He's doing political stuff, trying to get supplies for his men and, dealing with all sorts of things. I do think that period is terribly important because the Army's supply services had completely broken down. They just seized up. And that was a major reason why there was so much starvation that winter. And he had to reinvent those. And he needed Congress to help him with it. And at the same time, there was what is called by historians the Conway Cabal. And Conway was actually the least significant member of the group, but a few senior Army officers who wanted to move Washington out and replace him with Horatio Gates as commander-in-chief. Gates had won a big victory at Saratoga, and no fooling, it was a big victory. And Washington hadn't won a battle for some time, and Gates didn't look like a terrible choice. So Washington had to protect his position and also reinvent the Army, and he did, I think, a very smart thing. This is a time when you have 15 or 20 congressmen meeting. That's all that Congress was. And they were meeting in, I can't remember, it's York or Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and which is very close to Valley Forge. And he got a committee of 6 of them. So it was a significant chunk of them sent to Valley Forge to work with him on reconstituting the Army and coming up with a whole new plan. And he got them at Valley Forge so they could see how terrible things were. And so he could work on them himself and they could be impressed with him because he was very impressive. And I think when you come out of Valley Forge in the late spring and early summer of 1777, the Army is functioning. And when they got to Valley Forge, it really wasn't. And they win a battle at Monmouth Courthouse, which is essential, both for his career and for the war effort, for the national morale. And there are those who say it was just a draw, and my attitude is he needed a win, so it was a win. And that was his attitude, definitely. And it just showed his adroitness. When these guys came after him, Gates and a fellow named Mifflin and Conway, Washington didn't rise to the bait. He didn't react the way he would have 20 years before. He would have been enraged and carried on and complained about them all up and down the country. He just kept his mouth shut and allowed them to overplay their hands. And then he struck. And it's not an uncommon experience when you see whenever somebody goes after Washington in a sort of political knife fight, they don't do well. He had a very good talent for eliminating his adversaries.
Well, let Patricia ask the big question. Obviously, this is the big question. It's one of those great things that's unanswerable, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you agree with the indispensable man assessment and think that the American Revolution would not have succeeded without George Washington? Tell us about your take on this. How indispensable was George Washington from 1775 till the end of the war?
He was indispensable, yes, as a national symbol, which was something he could do. Not everybody could do that. There are wonderful political figures of this era. Take John Adams, as smart as he could be and did wonderful things, but I don't think he could be a national symbol. He's just not sort of in his skill set. Washington could be. It's very impressive. There's a French diplomat or soldier who writes, traveling with Washington towards the end of the war, every time they came into a new town, it was as though he was every man's father or brother. He had managed to impress so many people that he was the glue. And it's important. We had no tradition of the United States of America. We had, these colonies who didn't have much to do with each other. It was really hard to get from one colony to another. Most people never left their homes, their home communities. And there was Congress, which, because it's a political body, basically everybody hated. There was the Army, which, won a few battles and lost a few battles. But there was Washington, who was always there, a man who could inspire trust, had integrity, had character, and showed leadership. He was an impressively modest man, which, he would get such adulation when he entered town. He would walk right into town and they'd set off fireworks and fire the cannons and ring all the church bells. But it didn't turn his head. So I think he was indispensable as a leader, perhaps not so much as a military figure. And I think there's another point in his life, at the Constitutional Convention, he is also indispensable.
The David Ramsey, one of the first historians of the war, makes a comment. I think it's famous, certainly famous to me, that the revolution didn't just demand talents; it created them, or something to that effect. Did the war years change Washington? And if so, what did he learn from the war years? How did he emerge from the revolutionary period different from the man who entered it?
I think he learned his own powers. He was a man who was used to excelling at things. That's what he expected of himself. He was very ambitious. But they had done a remarkable thing in winning against the British. And they had won with this notion, and it was central to the war effort, the notion of self-government, of this idealistic reinvention of the political life. Now, a point I make in the book is Americans in the colonial era actually had a fair amount of self-governing power with colonial legislatures, more than most people on earth did at the time. But they made it their cause. And that was what they fought for. And I think it elevated Washington, and it gave him something that meant so much to him for the rest of his life. And it's why when he was called back into service, he sometimes bellyached about it, but he always answered the bell.
People may have heard of Mount Vernon before 1783 or 1784 when Washington retires to it, but it becomes a symbol and an all-important site for the nation once he returns to Mount Vernon and returns to his farm. This period between 1783 and, of course, the Constitutional Convention, which you've mentioned, and I want to get to in a second. How do you think about Washington in this period of just 4 short years between the end of the war and the convention?
I see it as two different periods. When he first gets there, he really thinks he's there for life. He doesn't. He's done his bit, and he loves Mount Vernon. He had a great life before the war, and he's looking forward to restoring it. I think he loves his wife, and he hadn't seen her much for a long time. She did come to the winter camps. And he writes a few letters when people are saying, oh my God, everything's falling apart, it's terrible. And he writes these calming letters, don't worry about it. We're just like a young heir coming into an inheritance, and we'll calm down. And by 1785, he's writing those letters saying, we're falling apart, this is terrible. And he really has decided that the government under the Articles of Confederation is the mere shadow of a government. It is can't control the states. The states are picking at each other. The economy is terrible. This is something we tend to overlook, but it was probably the worst depression we've ever had, worse than the 1930s. And the federal government at the time was really not a government. It was just Congress. There was no executive branch. There were no courts. And it couldn't do much. So I think by 1785, 1786, he's got the message and he's upset and he is trying to figure out ways to help a movement. And, Madison is his right-hand man in this effort, or some might describe him as his goad, who is getting him to get back on his horse. And I think the two of them become essential partners in pushing for an effort to reinvent the government.
Well, that takes us to Philadelphia in 1787, where I think the political operation of Washington is, in some ways, people don't see it when they read about the convention. What they see is a silent man standing at the front, presiding over things. But obviously, he's much more than that. Tell me about George Washington in the months of the convention itself as a political figure.
Yeah, it's a frustrating thing, having written about the convention now in 3 different books, that, our sources are so thin. They were not supposed to talk about what went on outside the room, and most of them didn't. A few did. And we have Madison's notes, and we have the official journal, which is really bare bones. So, and a few recollections that people offered as they got older, and it is it can't be the whole story. There were a lot of sidebar conversations. There was a lot of scheming in the taverns and at social events, which we don't know about. And we certainly have no one who suggests that Washington was part of that. But when he gets to the convention, everybody knows he wants a stronger government. He's been writing letters about this. And it's an era where you show, if you get a letter from George Washington, you show it to everybody you know. You wrote a letter knowing that people would show it to everybody else. So most of the delegates there had seen or heard about Washington's desire for a stronger government. And he thought the national government had to be superior to the states, that was not acceptable to have the states basically shooting each other all the time, that there had to be a taxing power, that if you cannot levy taxes, and under the Articles of Confederation, they couldn't, the states had to do it, you don't have a government. And he also thought there had to be an executive, that without an executive, also you can't get anything done. And he was a big picture fellow. I don't think he was down in the weeds about, what the patent system ought to be and that sort of the ex post facto clauses. But he cared tremendously about those large issues. And they're not very controversial there. And I think a lot of that is because of Washington. They know that that's what he wants. They want him to be the first president. Several delegates wrote afterwards that we all knew he was going to be the first president. And so they wanted to produce a government that he would find acceptable. So I don't think he had to go around and twist arms and, talk to people about what he needed. They knew, and frankly, he and Madison and the other Virginia delegates present their blueprint in the Virginia plan at the very beginning of the convention, and it's there, what is going to be needed, and he gets it. I've always loved the lyric from Miranda's Hamilton show that, when Madison and Jefferson sing, "Wouldn't it be nice to have Washington on our side?" There is a period of about 20 years in American politics when, if you've got Washington on your side, you're going to win. And you do see that at the convention. The things he wants are done.
This might be a good time to ask a question that John suggests. There's a lot of things that we could talk on the issue of slavery and Washington's relationship with it. But let me ask a question about slavery and politics, because it's in places like Philadelphia, any casual historian knows that compromise and some emerging idea of a distinction between North and South is there. Slavery and national politics is becoming a thing. Could you talk to us a little bit about Washington and the politics of slavery?
Yeah, just a quick word. Just personally, he is he owns many slaves, and I found no evidence that it bothered him until the war. The war experience, I think, changes him, partly because of African-American soldiers, maybe partly because he's with people who are anti-slavery, like Lafayette and Hamilton and John Lawrence, and they influence him. And he knows a lot of slave owners. They're his relatives and friends. And I think he wants, in some intellectual level, for slavery to go away. And I think most Americans did, even the slave owners. They recognized it as a crime, and they recognized it as insupportable. And the northern states began in the 1780s to enact these gradual emancipation laws, which could take a generation or two, but would end slavery in those states. The southern states never did, of course, because slave owning was so much more widespread. Washington always privately said that he wished such legislation would be adopted for the whole nation. He never said it publicly. We don't have an explanation for why he never said it publicly. My inference is that he didn't think it'd help, that it wasn't going to work. And him saying so was only going to undermine his political position. And he was a man of inconsistency on the subject. Several times in his life, he announced his policy on his own slave owning and treatment of slaves, which he then contradicts. So he says, I'm not going to buy any more slaves, but then there's a really good deal and he really needs this particular slave, so he buys them. And it is disappointing for those of us who study him. He also clearly is anxious about the financial issues in emancipation for slave owners. He feels that acutely because he has a unique problem with more than half of the slaves at Mount Vernon, as you know, were really owned by the estate of Martha's first husband. So he can't actually free them unless he buys them basically from the estate. And that's a lot of cash that he's never had. So I think he feels terribly stymied about the issue, frustrated, and he is inconsistent about the issue. There's your colleague, Mary Thompson's book on slavery at Mount Vernon has that wonderful passage where she says, it's important for us to remember that everything bad that could happen to a slave happened at Mount Vernon. We can't sugarcoat that.
That's right. We've come to the convention, as you mentioned, they've already described him as the obvious choice to be the first president. And I don't know, let's just skip straight ahead to April 1789 when he becomes the first president. And he gives his first address, the first inaugural address, one of the great speeches in our political calendar is the inaugural address, and Washington sets that pattern. John from the audience, could be a different John, I'm not entirely sure, asked a question about Washington's presence in a room. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about his charisma, his stage presence. You've already mentioned that he wasn't a great orator, but what is his presence in, say, April 1789?
Well, first of all, there's everything he carries in the room with him, which is, he won the war, and he's the hero of two continents. So that is part of the presence. He also John Adams, again, described him once as the best actor we've ever had as president. He knows how to deport himself in public. He always has dignity. He always is courteous and appropriate. And that is what sort of sets our expectation for a president, is someone who knows how to behave. And he never disappoints. His speeches themselves can be, a bit vanilla. He was not given to purple phraseology, and to be honest, as long as he had James Madison write them, he was never going to have anything purple per se. But he says it with such integrity. One of the things that struck me about him was he did weep in public on occasion, at least two I can recite. One when he resigns from the Army, resigns his commission. And he wasn't embarrassed about that. He had strong emotions and he acknowledged them. And I think that was part of his, emotional accessibility. I think if you look at the question of emotional intelligence, again, an idea we have in recent years and not so much in the 18th century, but I think he had it in a unique way. And that was part of his presence. He's also the tallest guy there. And I got diverted, but we also should remember he studied drama, not formally, but he went to plays every chance he got. And I think he was loved to see how actors controlled and commanded a space. Sometimes you speak slowly, leave a pause, you make eye contact, you look away maybe because you want to demonstrate you're thoughtful. I think he had mastered those talents.
The culmination of politics, at least in the American world, is to become president. There's no higher target. Washington achieves it. And in this great story of the rise of the political Washington, I wonder if you could give us your take on the Washington presidency. How did his political talents translate into his ability to be the president he wanted to be?
Well, I think I would say the first term was the president he wanted to be. He had Hamilton and Jefferson in his cabinet. So he had, essentially both wings of the public opinion inside the tent. And the essential deals, legislative deals that needed to be struck, he was able to strike. And I think, he wanted to resign after the first term, and I was talked out of it. I believe he regretted that. The second term was bumpy. He becomes a target for the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans. We have the war break out in Europe, and the French and fighting everybody else after the revolution. He concludes we can't have another war with Britain because of the Royal Navy is too immense a force for us to resist. And the Americans who sympathize with the French, who were our allies during the revolution, become angry with him. He's got to deal with the Whiskey Rebellion. It is a difficult second term. And, again, he sort of sets the precedent for American presidencies. Most two-term presidencies, the second term isn't quite as good as the first. And that was his experience, too. You do find there are a couple of accounts of, in his last few days in office in 1797, he's as frisky as a teenager. I mean, he's just so eager to get out of the job. So I think the last 4 years were pretty hard.
Well, we're running low on time, and I've enjoyed this conversation, David, immensely. I've enjoyed the book. I hope everyone grabs a copy. There's a final question from an anonymous audience member, and there's plenty of questions that I didn't have a chance to get to. I hope not too many. But he asked a big question. I hope you can reflect on this. He asked, what drew you to study and write American history? And I'm curious, why write American history? You've done it successfully. You keep at it. What keeps drawing you to this work?
It's my history. I'm a mutt. My family, I'm part Jewish, part Irish, part German. And the one thing was everybody wanted to be an American. They all came here because they wanted to be an American. And so it has always been the thing I cared most about, was understanding it. I love all history, but American history in particular. And the founding era, which I've now done 4 books on, is such a fluid moment. I often get the question, why don't we have brilliant people like we had back then? And my answer usually is, our leaders don't have the same opportunity. What the founding fathers and mothers get credit for is they realized they had an extraordinary opportunity to change history, to form a new nation based on new ideas, or ideas that had been around but had never really been implemented effectively. And, boy, they made the most of it. And I think that's just a great story. And so that has drugged me back over and over again.
Well, thank you for writing this book. I've enjoyed talking with you about it. I hope to see you again in Mount Vernon soon. And thanks to the Atlanta History Center for inviting me to be a part of this conversation.